I'm Ben, welcome to my book corner, and today we've hit book 4 of my Read What You Own challenge, 16 Souls by Rosie Talbot, also known as Merry Child on TikTok and Twitter. And this book first came out in October of 2022. The version I read is 361 pages. As always, we shall take a look at the story, the characters, the world building and the presentation before I give my final thoughts at the end, so let's just jump straight in. Best way to describe this is a paranormal investigation story. Now, it does have some parallels to Cemetery Boys, but this is more plot driven than that title was. So we're following Charlie in this. Charlie can see ghosts following a near-death experience. And he's out one day, thinks he's getting tailed, and one of his ghosts who travels around with him, after they get home, says, I'm going to find out who that guy is. I'm going to find out some more information, but seems rattled. So you know straight from the off that something isn't right somewhere. The ghost never comes back. So then you have a missing ghost inquiry as Charlie goes around trying to find out where the ghost has gone. And he's got his other ghost friends to help him with this. He's asking other ghosts around York as well, as, you know, he can see the ghost. And this leads him to meet Sam Harrow, who is also a seer, and he is in the city specifically because he believes ghosts are going missing, and he's investigating that. And they go around to somewhere some of the more famous ghosts are, like Mad Alice in York, to see what's gone on because there's been no sightings, inverted commas. And they uncover gradually a plot to capture X amount of ghosts to achieve another end. Overall, this is actually quite a good investigation story. There's plenty of red herrings in it and plenty of suggestions for who the villains are. And even when you think you've got an idea of who the sort of big bad is, that leads into the next book because they're a smaller part of a much bigger machine. So it's a really, really interesting sort of mystery to drive you along and does actually sort of help elevate the story of this one. So there's some interesting character work here, especially around Charlie as the main character. He's not especially likable though, but that kind of makes sense because of everything that he's gone through. His whole deal is the fact that he died in the hospital, and then when he was brought back to life, he could see the ghosts. He lost his legs, so he is constantly either on prosthetic limbs or he does have a wheelchair. But he's very self-conscious about this, and he prefers the pain and the rubbing of dealing with the prosthesis than going out in the wheelchair because of people looking at him. Also because York as a city is not exactly the widest of cities in the world. He doesn't want people looking at him and bumping into him. He doesn't want to be noticed. And this is also driven by the fact that some of his friends saw him fall into a death loop. I'll touch on death loops later on. And that freaked them out, and they realised they could never tell the truth about what they really saw because all of them would have been committed. And because of all this, he's incredibly insular and doesn't have any living friends. Now, he does have good relationships with the ghosts, however. Audrey, Heather and Ollie are the three main ones, although he has got other ghosts that he has interacted with, although he tries not to because once ghosts realise that you can interact with them, they sort of get pulled to them. There are other ghosts around that he does interact with at times as well, but he doesn't want to be noticed. He's at the back end of school, he wants to just get through his exams and then just move on with his life. Also, there's various stuff with his family life. His family are working as much as they can just try and monetarily support the family, and relatives as well who will keep falling ill, so there's lots of time constraints and pull on him as well. And on top of that as well, Charlie is gay and he has not come out to anyone at this point of the story either, largely because he doesn't have any trust for anyone. Now, the other character who's a major character in here is Sam. And when they start to meet up, they have some interesting dynamics early on, as Charlie is incredibly spiky and, to be honest, a bit of a dick a lot of the time. But he finds Sam attractive. Now, Sam is transgender female to male from a really, really rich family and is also a seer as well. But the problem I have with Sam is that he doesn't get as much of a rounding personality. He gets an interesting backstory, as does his family, but he's mainly there to deliver exposition about magic and ghosts, to kind of fill in the knowledge of how things work in the world, which is a shame because when he does have a chance to normally interact with the ghosts and with Sam, it's pretty good. The other two characters that appear are Mitch and Leonie, and these are childhood friends of Charlie's. Mitch is notable because I don't know if he was Charlie's first kiss, but he may have been. But after Mitch and Leonie saw Charlie get dragged into a death loop, they sort of pulled away, and I'll touch on why that is when I get to world building. So now Mitch and Leonie are dating, and there is some little things about what their preferences are, so on and so forth, and how they've changed and drifted away. And the ghosts are really interesting as well. Whilst most of them don't get a huge amount of time on the page, you get the sense of the history of the city because of the ghosts, as they range everywhere from the Roman Empire to reasonably modern day. So you get the whole cavalcade of ages and ghosts looking and talking in different ways, which also is really, really good. And the different ways that they interact, especially when they don't always understand exactly what's going on, even though some of them have been watching how the world has changed, because they're quite often tethered into one place, they don't see it all. So overall, the character work is solid. I think because I've just read Cemetery Boys again, the relationship between Yadriel and Julian in there is so good in the centerpiece of that story that this kind of pales, unfortunately, in comparison. So I think reading this so soon afterwards has sort of coloured my interpretation a little bit, if I'm honest. But what is here is very solid. So first off with the world building, I do need to mention I am a Northern English person. I have been to York, although it's been a few years, but I do have enough familiarity that I do kind of can easily envisage some of these places. And what this book does a really good job of is sort of dialing into the heritage of York as a historical place. It is a very, very old city. So it has a lot of the narrow, tight, sort of winding walkways, almost maze-like in many regards. It's got the medieval architecture built into it as well. And also it does have a reputation for ghosts and the paranormal. There is a thriving industry of people who do ghost walks and ghost hunts around the city. And the sort of focus on that as an industry on its own, even with some merchandise and stuff like that, really does drive home that this is a home of the supernatural here in the UK. In terms of actual physical descriptions, a lot of it does not get a huge amount here, and it doesn't really need it, because this is more about getting the claustrophobic and spooky vibe rather than getting the physical representation of the place. But when it does need to be done, for example, when you go in into like the cathedrals or abbeys, whatever the right word is, or the graveyards, it does again do a good job of explaining stuff in such a way that adds to the spooky element of the story. And also when they're talking about the various different types of magic and the runes and the various different things that are used, that again adds to quite an earthy sense to the story. The other thing though that works really well is the focus on the ghosts itself. First of all, ranging from the sheer historical breadth of when the ghosts are from, you know, modern day all the way back to Roman times in the case of some of them. But you get the different speech patterns between them. There's a ghost that ends up as a pretty regular member of the book from a certain point called Villiers. And they were an admiral and they were part of the Stuart court centuries back. And they talk in all flowery prose and the sooth, sire, and all that wonderful floral English that has fortunately gone away at this point because it throws me every time. But on top of that, you've got little snapshots of history from all the other ghosts you meet, you know, orphans and orphanage mothers and just normal everyday people or ancient kings. They're all in here, which again dives down really well into the history of the city in general and helps feed into the story of someone who can see ghosts. But where this really works is going into the difference between the ghosts, because there are different types. You've got ones that are tethered to one area so they can't go far beyond that. You've got the ones that have broken the tether and can wander around freely. You have the ones that, I think they're called hungry ones if memory serves, who want to consume the flesh of people because they think that'll fetch them back. Now, specifically, they can't touch most people. That's important, only seers, which is part of the reason why Charlie doesn't let on that you can see them most of the time. But the most interesting one is the Deathloop ghost. So what a Deathloop ghost is a ghost that is reliving the moments of their death over and over again for all eternity. And generally speaking, this death would be a really violent death. So, for example, if you were crucified or hung, drawn and quartered or stuff like that. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, Charlie can't sense these death loops until he pretty much walks into them. So he's had to map them out around the city. But unfortunately, death loops can occasionally move. For example, if one happened in a certain building and that building gets demolished, the death loop is going to move to another place that stays more stable and it can tether itself to. And what happens when he wanders into a death loop is that he relives the experience of the ghost, but not just mentally, but physically as well. So if that ghost was getting cut up by a load of people with knives, he starts to show lacerations on his body. And this is kind of a thing that happened in view of his two friends, Mitch and Leonie. And they saw this and they couldn't tell anyone because they just seemed like they were mad. If they said, well, he just started floating up in the air and cuts appeared on him, because nobody's going to believe anything like that. And overall, it does a really good job. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in presentation because there's some really interesting use of language in here as well, which really does help with the world building. But I'm going to touch on that in presentation in a second. Okay, presentation. Let's start with the cover as always. And I think this is actually a beautiful cover. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, the colour scheme with the blues really does add to the supernatural feel of the book in general. But it's the imagery here with the moon behind Charlie, which gives him almost like a halo, a crescent, a saviour sort of aspect to him. But how uncomfortable he looks, sort of pulling at his shoulder because he is the centre of attention. He's the central point for the story, and this is something that he's not comfortable with, as he doesn't really want to be noticed. And I really, really do appreciate how that represents what he's like at the beginning, sort of being forced to the forefront of what's going on. Now, in terms of pacing, this starts off reasonably slow and amps up at a gradual pace until it hits the final act, where it goes full throttle. And the general layering of information as it becomes available to us, and the extra levels of mystery that are added about what's going on, because every question they answer leads to two more questions. So, are they going missing? Yes. How? Why? And then you go off and it becomes who, how, why, and who it is. And then they get different options for that, and they start investigating the different people, which then builds into the lore of the ghosts and the stories and so on and so forth. That is really, really well done. But what I really want to talk about is sentence structure, which is not something I talk about very often, specifically because this is possibly the most English book I have ever written. Now, by English, I mean British English. And by British English, I mean Yorkshire. So there is in the foreword, it's mentioned that there's a lot of British colloquialisms in here. And this does read the inner monologues and the dialogue. This is incredibly accented with a Yorkshire accent. And that is really, really impressive to me personally, because as a rule of thumb, when I read books, I don't really hear an accent for the characters in my head. I'll hear a voice, but the accent tends to be quite neutral a lot of the time. Not always. There are some tricks that can be done with some accents that help drive it through. So you can add a South American drawl, for example, is thrown in sometimes, and it's explained within the thing. And sometimes the text actually tells you what the accent is like. This doesn't have to, because of the word choice and the sentence structure here, because a lot of the sentence structure in the inner monologue isn't what you'd call Queen's English or pure English or whatever the choice of term is. Words sometimes fit the wrong way around, but it sounds like someone from Yorkshire, because this is how quite often northern people in general do speak. I say this as someone who lives in Manchester, and I really, really like that. And I was discussing this in one of the Discord groups I was in, and they asked for an example. And the example I gave them included a couple of insults were in there, and it's like, wow, is that how British people speak? It's like, no, that's how northern people speak. And that led to a load of communications. I'm going to use an example, though, of one of the words. And I would like you to let me know in the comments below what it means, especially if you're not from the UK. Ginnel. What is a ginnel? I'd love to know what people think that is. So yeah, just in terms of presentation, I absolutely adored that, and that really sold me on this book, probably more than anything else, because this is obviously someone, Rosie Talbot, who's written this, obviously knows York and has heard the way people speak there and has done an amazing job of getting that onto the page consistently throughout the story, and I really appreciate that. Final thoughts then, and this is pretty good. I'm looking forward to reading the follow-up. The reason this falls slightly short for me is simply because I read Cemetery Boy straight before it, and I think the character work in that is better than here. Nothing here is bad, and in terms of plot, this is actually in many regards a lot stronger, but I do like my character pieces slightly more, and that just landed the chemistry slightly better than this one did. Now, that being said, this is still a very high B tier for me personally. It has a compelling mystery, it's got good world building, the writing style is incredibly unique and does an amazing job of catching the location that this is set in, and you know, the character work is really, really strong overall. So I'm looking forward to reading the follow-up, which is 12 Bones, which, funny story, I bought that first, because of course I did. But that's my thoughts on 16 Souls by Rosie Talbot. I'd love to know yours. Let me know in the comment below, and also don't forget to let me know what the word Ginnel means. I'll catch you next time.